Part 2. Desire, Freedom, and Captivity. 7. Voyage to the Unknown. March 1888. Earnshaw stared out over the ocean, its choppy surface ruffled with constant wind, and a muddy sky rendered it a dead indigo. He had never recalled seeing anything so sinister. Only one other time in African waters had he felt such a gloomy weight on his shoulders, but that was long ago, and best forgotten. Now he was forced to remember, for his life, his and Charlotte's, could very well depend on those long-buried memories. He flinched as a gust of salt air buffeted against him with unaccustomed force, nearly knocking him from his feet. He clasped the rim of his high felt hat and wrapped his coat tighter against his body. They should still be safe from the most powerful storms that sweep with deadly efficiency from India to the African Horn, the Indian Ocean still slumbering in its watery depths. They should, but now he began to have his doubts as he clutched at the smooth rail of the deck. Earnshaw gazed up at the single steel funnel that towered into the sky, oddly juxtaposed between two square-rigged masts. No, the Sardegna was no beauty, rather a classic example of utilitarian steam technology. The small Italian ship had made remarkable time, considering the interminable red tape and clumsy bureaucracy at almost every port where they had dropped anchor. It was a pity he had no idea where they were going. He gazed at the sea with grim humour. Considering all the facts, he should be terrified. From the moment the dark carriage had swept himself and Charlotte away from Highgate Manor to the docks of Bristol and loaded them onto the Spartan but swift cargo ship, he knew nothing. Their sole guide had been the Arab driver, who, for a few terse words, remained mute. More like a shadow he would appear and just as swiftly fade into the background. Instinctively, Earnshaw looked about for the gloomy figure, briefly toying with the idea that perhaps he, as well as this journey, were only some aberrant hallucination. He was almost grateful that Charlotte had retired to her cabin, succumbing to her stomach's losing battle with the ocean. Today had been a brutal onslaught of whistling winds and tempestuous waters, and even the power of steam was humbled by nature's petulant temper. But these few weeks at sea had given him an odd sense of calm and a creeping sense of familiarity. How could he not remember the vivid blue waters of the Mediterranean, the golden sands that banked the Nile, or the gentle breezes that swept from the desert in warm, caressing gusts? He forgot nothing. The more he tried, the more he remembered. He looked up at the billowing steam and saw so many images, so many faces. Reginald, devilishly rakish, so confident in his destiny. His beautiful wife, Kyra, the slow-eyed daughter of Saharan chieftain, and their son, Geoffrey. Geoffrey. Earnshaw bit his lips, as if its invocation would somehow rouse the phantom back from the recesses of time. A prospect too frightful to imagine. Memories swift and merciless stabbed through his brain. Pressing against the rail, Earnshaw closed his eyes as if he could shut out the entire world, and remembered. She hated him. There was no doubt about it. One only had to look at them. 8-year-old Charlotte sat hunched, silently staring into her plate. And him, enveloped in Arab robes, he sat at the end of the table, as silent and unmoving as the great Sphinx. They were separated by a dining table. It might have well been a continent. Earnshaw had to do everything in his power to keep from rubbing his hands together in unabashed glee. Everything was going as planned. Would anyone care for soup? He had to be mindful to keep his voice from sounding too cheerful. He looked across the table to his daughter, who, at least briefly, was the image of a proper young lady, her hair tied back in a prim bow. She was wearing the frock that he had brought back from his latest excursion, using the trip to Cairo as his excuse. Desperate for supplies, my dear. She must never discover the real reason for his journey. He would never forgive himself if she did. Had he made a mistake in bringing her here? He had brought his youngest with him to this God-forsaken land in an impetuous moment, hoping she would make Africa more bearable. In many respects, they had never been so happy. Father and daughter had discovered the mighty Nile with wandering eyes. They sat on the dusty banks for hours, watching the tiny dhows manoeuvre around the lumbering cargo vessels, their pale linen sails as delicate as butterfly wings, gliding across golden waters. Nothing could ever possibly compare to Charlotte's wonder at seeing her first camel, exploring the mighty pyramids. Together they would learn Africa's secrets, all except for the tragedy, and that secret Earnshaw would take to his grave. No, Charlotte knew nothing, and she never would, because everything had gone according to plan, except for him. Earnshaw looked down at the length of the table at the new and unexpected threat to the Earnshaw household, and regretted his momentary weakness in showing mercy to the lad. Geoffrey could talk, and knowing Charlotte, she would absorb every word like a sponge. But not if they hated each other. Earnshaw beamed happily at his daughter in her fine new dress from Cairo. Yes, he had gone, forced himself to stock on needed supplies. He had also hired mercenaries and haggled over the unspeakable. Even today he could see the blood soaking into the thirsty desert sand. 1,000 pardons, Your Grace. He looked up into the dusky face of a servant poised over him with a bottle of wine. A deep vermilion soaked the linen tablecloth. He shook away the image. He watched his daughter as she squashed a breadcrumb with her fork. Oh, yes, she could be a problem if not controlled properly. But control her he would. "How now, child?" he inquired gently. "What have you been up to this fine day?" The reassuring bustle of servants and the fragrant tureen of mulligatawny soup gave Earnshaw an unexpected heartiness. He let a mouthful of wine slide down his throat with fiery satisfaction as he waited for an answer. Charlotte never lifted her eyes from the Chinese porcelain as soup was ladled into her bowl. "I have been up to nothing, Papa." "But surely you have done something today. Perhaps you were able to better acquaint yourself with young Master Geoffrey." "No, Papa." Charlotte's eyes remained downcast. Emboldened by the wine, he persisted with dogged authority. Earnshaw dipped his spoon into the thick soup with a gusty flourish. "I find that curious, very curious indeed. You are absolutely certain that nothing transpired between the two of you? Nothing at all?" Charlotte squirmed. "Yes, Papa, I'm sure. I hardly know—" Her lashes lifted briefly to the boy. "He exists." Earnshaw caught her furtive glance as Geoffrey's own face flushed. "Then can you explain to me, child?" Earnshaw gulped a steaming spoonful of soup and winced at the unexpected burn. "If indeed this lad does not exist, how is it that I saw the two of you together this morning? In the stables, to be exact." Earnshaw blotted his mouth with a napkin, ignoring Charlotte's gasp of surprise. Tears began to well in Charlotte's eyes as she stared into the untouched soup before her. Geoffrey stared at her. "I said nothing, Papa. He talked to me." Finally, Earnshaw carefully placed his spoon next to his bowl and brought his hands together, templing his fingers. He scrutinized Geoffrey's stony profile. "Ah, yes, Master Geoffrey." His words were clipped, pushing down his annoyance. "I find it very interesting that you chose to break your vow of silence with none other than my youngest child. I gather that it was a stimulating conversation? My daughter loves to hear stories, and you must have many to tell." The boy's shoulders tensed beneath the robes, defiance emanating from him like a flame. He met Earnshaw's gaze full on. His contempt and silence were palpable. "Enough," Earnshaw slammed his hands to the table, all patience gone. Let us hope you do not go so far as to confuse fact with fabrication. We would not want those more innocent to be fooled by the creations of an overheated brain. Eyes blazing, Geoffrey finally stood glowering down at him. Already he was half a head taller. He spoke finally, his youthful voice quavering with emotion. "Are you calling me a liar?" Earnshaw had him. He could feel the trickle of sweat beneath the stiff collar of the formal dinner shirt. He knew that he should stop, and yet he persisted, his own anger rising. "Only if lies are what you choose to tell. Since the day I rescued you from the bowels of the desert, you have chosen your own spiteful counsel, preferring to repay my kindness with your malicious silence. Now I see that you have deigned to inflict your venom on my daughter, of all people. Why on God's earth would you choose her?" "No, Papa, I lied. I spoke to him first." Charlotte's protestation was little more than a whine. His fingers drumming in agitation, Earnshaw affixed Charlotte with a censorious glare. "I care not a whit who spoke first. I care about what was said." He leaned forward, meeting Geoffrey head-on. "So, young Master Geoffrey, with what nonsense have you been filling my daughter's head?" The question was no longer a polite inquiry. It was a thinly veiled threat, pure and simple. Geoffrey glowered, unfurling himself slowly with the menace of a cobra. His voice was a low hiss. "I will never answer to you." Earnshaw thrust himself across the table, his body shaking. "Yes, by God you will! If it weren't for me, you would have been picked clean by the jackals by now. You owe me nothing less than your life, and your silence. Now that it is broken, tell me what you said." A scream pierced the air. Earnshaw blinked as wind screeched a fierce warning of an impending storm. The bulky vessel plunged into a rolling wave, and a pelting spray almost blinded him. His heart pounded. Even in the throes of a gale, it was Geoffrey that made him shudder. The ship plunged once again, and this time Earnshaw fell, his hat swept in one savage gust over the side. Sturdy arms hauled him to his feet, and Earnshaw focused unsteadily on a familiar naval uniform. "You'd better get below, sir. Monsoon's upon us." But before he could reply, he looked up and saw the largest wave of his life. It rose over the vessel like a great towering mountain. At first Charlotte did not hear the storm. She only felt it. It hammered at the walls until she thought they would burst. But she was too sick to care, at least in the beginning. Early on, the flame of the cabin lamps had sputtered out in the ever-increasing tempest, and she had lain in the darkness illuminated only by a tiny salt-encrusted porthole, sick from the constant lurching of the floor beneath her. She had anticipated adventure, but this was sheer misery. She lay cocooned in a tangle of bedclothes, having removed her travelling suit, a mannish concoction of heavy serge. It now swung maddeningly from her steamer trunk. She watched it sway and bounce with the precision of a fiendish metronome, and as the storm intensified, she gazed with dizzied awe as the trunk itself began to slide across the tilting floor. Charlotte moaned into her pillow. If only she could just die. The entire voyage had the air of a dream about it. From that cold dawn morning standing at the steps of Highgate, she knew something extraordinary awaited her. And it did, as readily as the carriage that burst forth like Cerberus bolting the gates of hell. It had emerged from the fog, nearly upon them, charges as black as night, drawing a carriage so forbidding she feared it would crush them beneath its wheels. But it was the driver that had sent shivers up her spine, and a warning to her heart. A robed apparition shrouded head to foot in black. Without a word, he gestured to the carriage, and her father obeyed and continued to obey without question or comment, until they boarded the Sardinia to their unknown destination. But she could see, as each port slipped behind them, her father charting the waters, making quiet calculations upon their forthcoming routes. Now that they were past the Suez and the Arab Peninsula, he had no doubt their destination would be Mombasa or Dar es Salaam, with two formidable European colonies. She had secretly breathed a sigh of relief. Thank heavens! They would be near civilization. Still, the spectre dogged their every step. He never had to make his presence known. Charlotte could feel it. She would be standing on deck, looking up at the splendid rock of Gibraltar or the sandy shoals of Tripoli, and she would know he was there like a dark, foreboding shadow. His inky garb puzzled her. He wore the flowing robes of the desert, but they were unlike anything she had ever seen, elaborately embroidered in geometric configurations of black and purple. His finely woven tunic was concealed by a long vest lined in black sheepskin. The silken turban wound in heavy silk cord concealed all but weathered obsidian eyes. They watched her, unblinking. Charlotte gasped. The ship careened and dropped as if the sea had opened beneath them. Then she heard sounds, horrible, terrifying sounds. The first was the roar so loud she thought a locomotive was bearing down on her. The second was the explosion. Clothing and furniture crashed against the window as she was thrown like a rag doll across the floor. Could they be sinking? Frantically, Charlotte clawed through the rubble towards a golden sliver of light. She had to escape. She had to find her father. She lunged for the door and freedom and straight into the arms of the shadow. If she screamed, she could not hear it. If she was heard, she could not feel it. She only felt his bony fingers digging into her skin. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words couldn't have been hers. They were too terrified. What do you want? For the first time the shadow spoke. The voice was little more than a whisper, cloaked by the thick inflection of an unknown desert race. I have come for you. I beg your pardon? We leave. Now. Charlotte frantically fought the confines of the black robes. She was tangled in the darkness. She could see nothing. But I can't. My father, where is he? The walls groaned. Water was everywhere. Her cries were strangled as he lifted her in sinuous arms. Her face pressed into the gloomy folds. She was pressed so tightly against him that she could not move. Silently, he carried her upwards, and only when her skin felt the icy tingle of salt air did he release her. Her bare feet slid on wet planks as she clasped her arms around her bare shoulders. Shivering in her wet chemise, she shouted into the gale, I demand that you tell me where my father is. He said nothing, more shadow than man. Then she felt the ship tremble, not from the gale, but from the depths within. Like a huge heart, the engine had pounded out a powerful cadence throughout the voyage. Now the strokes hesitated with great shuddering palpitations, slowing with painful certainty. Like a great dying beast, the vessel's last breath was expelled. As it lay motionless, waves crashed and pitched against wood and steel, the wind relentless. Her hair blew wildly about her face as she looked about in confusion. Why have we stopped? Charlotte knew that her voice could not be heard above the gale, just as she knew that the silent figure that towered over her would reach out with hands like talons. She tried to run, just as she was lifted into the air. Once again her cries were smothered by the black robes as she was carried swiftly across the ship's sodden deck. Then suddenly it was removed. She felt the bitter sting of wind against her skin, waves lashing at her feet below. Her gaze slid downwards. They were dangling precariously against the side of the ship, a tiny dinghy lurching beneath them. White foam waves lashed mercilessly at the great steel hull. She was being kidnapped. Wildly, Charlotte screamed. She tried to claw her way up the ship's heavy ropes as the diminutive boat beneath them rocked and bounced with the fury of the storm. A sailor stood up, balancing unsteadily from the tiny hull, hands outstretched, reaching for her. She kicked, ignoring the furious oaths, hands grabbing at her legs. Rope slipped through her fingers, lacerating her palms. With a sudden gasp, she fell. Rough hands wrapped themselves like a vice around her waist, throwing her violently to the floor of the dinghy as whitecaps crashed over her with drenching ferocity. The vessel lurched as a dark figure landed beside her with mute swiftness. They pushed away into the stormy waters of the Indian Ocean. Swells of great black waves rose above them, blotting out the sky. But Charlotte had no time for fear. She wept with unabashed fury and grief. "Be still, Bint." "But my father—" "Your father awaits you. Look!" Before them, rising and falling between great watery peaks and valleys, Charlotte saw another tiny boat, and within 3 men braced against the storm. An angular figure clutched at the familiar rain-soaked jacket of English tweed. Beyond her father's dinghy loomed the distinct and ragged outline of land. Narrowing her eyes, she could make out the tiny, spiky shapes of palm trees and what seemed to be jungle beyond. The sky fused with the murky waves around them into one great wash of indigo. Through the spray she could make out fiery pinpoints that shimmered like embers. "Now be quiet." The shadowy figure sat, pulling her next to him, the wind howling around them. The narrow confines of the wooden craft crowded in on her, suffocating and dark. The sky was extinguished by the growing fury of the massive waves that rose higher by the second. As the tiny dinghy listed precariously to its side, a great wall of water loomed overhead. Charlotte stood unsteadily. "I demand that you take me to my father this instant." She looked up, just as the wave swept her away. She was part of the ocean now, and yet she did not belong. Charlotte's body had become a spinning, swirling mass of flotsam within the powerful grasp of the tide. She had long ago given up fighting its power. Her lungs tortured her. They were bursting. Upwards she swam. Her body, her clothing, her hair, all were her enemies now, pulling her down. She couldn't breathe. Suddenly she surfaced and felt the icy wind on her face. She gasped for air. But violently she was pulled down yet again, spun forward by the propulsion of a massive wave. She was swept in a tumbling mountain of water. Her body hurtled into seaweed and sand, and finally, at last, she no longer knew or cared. Charlotte swallowed. Sand covered her lips, filled her mouth. Her arms and legs melded into the wet beach as easily as the tiny shells and seaweed scattered about her. A breeze teased her frozen skin. Voices echoed somewhere, far away, strange words she could not understand. She was alive. From beneath a mass of hair and seaweed, she lifted her head. Her eyes slowly focused. Their gaze travelled up past the foaming waves and debris to a pair of soft leather boots, then closed, welcoming darkness.